Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you to the Financial Services Club for the invitation to speak this evening. It feels incredibly strange. I've been consciously taking a holiday from pensions for the past 3 months, and rather rashly I appear to have accepted 2 invitations relating to pensions in the same week to get myself back into it. I've been watching tennis and cricket, so I apologise if my remarks are littered with sporting references this evening. It's my first speech since I stood down as CEO of the Pensions Regulator after 4 years at the beginning of March. It's a chance for me to look backwards and forwards, to share a few thoughts with you about the relatively recent past and the future of pensions. And I've no doubt that Con will have some ideas he wants to put out there as well and share with us this evening. But it'll be very interesting to hear your comments and your questions and your observations, because I suspect all of you, well, no, possibly not some of the younger members in the room, but all of you probably are savers in a pension of some sort. The inevitable health warnings about what I'm going to say, I'm speaking because I only can now in a solely private capacity this evening, personal capacity. For your own well-being, you will be glad to know I don't intend to try and cover the entire pensions landscape. My perspective, because of my recent experience, is very much focused on workplace pensions, albeit some of what I say may have a wider application, particularly to personal pensions. But first, perhaps for those of you who don't know me, a little context about what was going on when I took over as the Chief Executive of the Pensions Regulator in 2015. And it's a public appointment made by the Secretary of State at the DWP. Pensions Regulator is a public body accountable to Parliament through the Department of Work for Work and Pensions. Its budget at that point was about £80 million, and it employed about 500 people, and is based in Brighton. It was set up about 10 years ago, basically with the responsibility to protect member benefits for those who are saving through workplace pensions. And also, more recently, to deal with the implementation of the automatic enrolment legislation. And there's a story behind that, which is that when the legislation was brought in, there was a debate going on as to whether it should be given to HMRC or the Pensions Regulator. And the Pensions Regulator said, no, thank you, we don't want it. Government IT project and all that. Unfortunately, the week the decision was being made, HMRC lost a data disk. So it had to be given to TPR because it was politically impossible for it to go to HMRC. As it happens, as you'll see, I think there's a lot of positive things to say about it, and I'll come back to that. So, March 2015, what was going on? Well, the so-called freedom and choice legislation was just coming into effect. Indeed, during my first week as CEO of TPR, I was travelling up and down to Brighton on the train, and I was 55 years old at that point, and I received a call from someone offering to help me liberate my own pension. While I was on the train, I provided some considerable entertainment to the passengers in dealing with that, I can assure you. At the time, people were speculating as to whether we were moving into what might be called an end game on DB pensions. We'd already seen a substantial decline in the number of employers who were providing DB pensions. Indeed, my own previous employer, the FCA, had taken a decision to close its DB pension scheme to new entrants, and then eventually to stop accruals for existing staff as well. So that was not uncommon. TPR had at that stage managed to get large and medium-sized enterprises and employers to enrol their staff in a compliant automatic enrolment pension. But they were then, at that point, we were faced with the challenge of getting nearly 1 million small and micro employers to do the same within a very tight timescale. And by small and micro employers, I mean, for example, someone who employs a nanny and needs to enrol them in a pension, as well as your more obvious employers or businesses. As a consequence of automatic enrolment, master trusts, which are trust-based pensions which serve multiple employers, were growing rapidly, and they were proving a very attractive option for many employers in order to comply with automatic enrolment. And then the fun really started, because 9 days after I took after my post, we learnt that BHS had been sold for £1 with a large pension deficit, to no plan for resolving that deficit, and sold to someone with no retail experience. We launched an investigation straight away. If the regulator feels that there has been detriment to the savers' benefits in such situations through a transaction like that, it can investigate to see whether that detriment needs to be made good in some way. It was only a year later that all of that, of course, became front-page news when BHS then subsequently went into administration. And also in March 2015, we were in the run-up to a general election. I was therefore in what is called PERDA as a public official, as the CEO of a government-sponsored body. I hasten to add that was actually quite a good thing at the time, because it means that I had a couple of months to play myself in before I had to start speaking to the press, and so on. So that's the context of what was going on, and at the point at which I took over the role. And it's the context in which I've been reflecting on what happened over the 4 years and cogitating about what the future may hold. And I've decided this evening to focus on 3 particular areas. I want to talk a bit about automatic enrolment, because I don't think we talk about it enough. And I think people somehow regard it as done and dusted, and I think there's a lot more to think about on it. I want to talk about the importance of effective pensions administration and the key role that technology could play in this. And I know that's of particular interest to Con and our other panel members this evening. And I want to reflect briefly on the overall shape of workplace pensions provision and some particular challenges that, as an ex-regulator, I still feel need to be addressed. I hasten to add, I am not saying I have all the answers. So turning first of all then to automatic enrolment. Well, mechanistically, it has gone extremely well. Don't faint, it's a public sector IT project that worked. And there are a raft of lessons to learn from that, and I think should be learned. Projects like that need effective governance that involve both the government and the body that is responsible, and other key interested parties. You need to start small, learn the ropes, build credibility. You need to have plenty of contingency in your plans. You need to monitor what's going on like a hawk. And so take the opportunity to survey early users of the scheme or the system and act on their feedback. And above all, you need to keep the approach simple. But that's great. Mechanistic's fine, million micros and so on, all enrolled. Most of them met the deadline, and those that didn't were chased up and got over it eventually. Has it worked as a policy? Well, it's certainly the key example of a really challenging piece of public policy making that has survived changes of government and was eventually allowed to proceed through to full implementation. At the time I came in to TPR, the Cabinet Office were carrying out yet another review of automatic enrolment for Mr Cameron and Mr Osborne. I remember, for example, Oliver Letwin personally testing the online journey for small and micros and managing to find the only remaining cul-de-sac in it, of course. But so, you know, it went through quite a tortuous path, despite the fact that everybody was arguing it was the right thing to do. It was not easy to get it over the line and into full implementation. But of course we don't know yet whether it is actually working, whether it is going to generate better outcomes for people. It's too early to say. Opt-outs are refreshingly low so far, compared, for example, to what we expected when we looked at what had happened in Australia and New Zealand. But this is at a point when, for example, interest rates are extremely low. Engagement with pensions, as I'm sure you all know, is notoriously low in this country. Very, very difficult to get people to engage with their pension. And the whole automatic enrolment approach, which hands off inertia, reinforces that. So at what point will savers wake up to the challenge of whether they're saving enough? When will they start to pay attention to how the funds selected on their behalf are performing? If they do, I think this will pose real challenges for employers, for trustees, and for pension providers. They will need to explain and justify their choices and their charges. And if savers don't like what they see, then they will look for someone to blame, which is where, of course, regulators and politicians come into it. Now, if we accept that current contribution rates under automatic enrolment, the 8%, combined with the state pension, are not likely to provide sufficient income in retirement for most people, what's the likelihood of us seeing perhaps an increase in percentage contributions? Well, my personal view at the moment is that we will not see this if it involves an increased employer contribution. Certainly, I think that's true while we have a government of the right. There is real concern about the pressures on business and on small businesses in particular. Lots of people, Steve Webb, others, argue for an increase in the percentage contribution rate. But I think the political realities are likely to prevail in the short term, especially in a post-Brexit world. I think what we're likely to see far more of is tinkering at the edges. Some of the criteria, the age limits, the earnings limits, that type of thing. I also suspect we may see the mechanistic aspects of you're in unless you choose to opt out, used as a technique in other areas, for example, social care. Now, I hasten to add that I'm not saying that we would necessarily see a percentage contribution increase under a government of the left either at the moment. I think they probably have other fish to fry which they consider more urgent. The other thing with automatic enrolment is it's not yet clear how the interaction with freedom and choice will drive behaviour. If people build up lots of small pots, which they're increasingly likely to do in their working life, given they're having more and more jobs, or frequent changes of job, then does that mean that they're more likely to access them when they have the opportunity to do so? We know that, for example, under freedom and choice, the amounts being withdrawn tend to be the smaller pots, the £4,000 of this world, to spend on a holiday or to give towards a children's house deposit or something like that. How will what people see in terms of performance and charges influence their behaviour? Will the savings being put aside now actually survive all the way through to provide for later life and thus achieve the purpose of the original policy? 9 million people nearly in the UK are facing problem debt of some sort, and a good chunk of those people are in work. I think we're bound to see ongoing debates about whether it is right for any pension saving to remain tied up for them until they're 55 years old. The other thing you see from all of this, and it's key to understanding the whole UK workplace pension system, is the huge elements of trust that are involved. Trust in employers to choose a good scheme, trust in those providing and those administering the scheme, trust in those who regulate the scheme providers, the FCA and TPR, and it would be very easy for that trust and confidence to be forfeited if something went wrong. That is why, for example, at TPR we argued very strongly for a stronger regulatory regime for master trusts, equivalent to that applied by the FCA to the providers that they regulate. And thankfully the Minister for Pensions at the time, Ros Altman, agreed and initiated the work to change the law. Now, when I moved from FCA to TPR, I carried considerable amounts of baggage with me, arising from my time as the supervisor of small advisors, brokers and fund managers. notably a concern about the robustness of systems and processes and the efficacy of record keeping. The experience of legacy systems bolted together with nobody left in the organisation who understood them, and the endless reconfigurations that they've gone through, and that to the regulator, let alone the industry. Now, at TPR, the initial reaction to my concern about pensions administration was, well, we don't regulate third-party pension administrators. We only regulate trustees. But it was very clear that so much could go wrong. There was increasing complexity. People's employment records were getting way more complex. They were having career breaks, many more jobs moving around. There was reliance on individual systems with key points of failure. There was a history of underinvestment with margins cut to the bone. And there was persistent evidence of poor record keeping and of trustees' inability or unwillingness to get to grips with this. More recently, we've identified at TPR that it is a highly concentrated market with a few large providers of key infrastructure services, which creates the risk of significant dislocation if a key market participant fails. So as TPR moved towards a more rounded and comprehensive assessment of risks to members' benefits rather than just to an analysis of precise legal duties, it became clear this must be an area of focus for TPR. And it is of something that is of equal relevance to public and private sector schemes. It's also seemed to me, though, that from the beginning of my time at TPR, that this must be an area where new technology solutions can help us, where they can be applied and where it would make commercial sense to do so. And I was really interested to read the report from panel members to that effect, and in particular on the application of blockchain in these circumstances. Your paper focuses on its application to CDC schemes, of which more in a moment. But from a technology perspective, I suspect it may be an important point as regards the administration of all schemes, not just CDC. The record keeping and accounting for schemes has to be robust. It needs to offer accuracy and transparency, as your excellent paper argues. Without this, I worry that those, for example, who argue for a pensions dashboard at the moment and hold it up as a great example of how technology can drive change in pensions will end up being sorely disappointed. We risk mass disillusionment and anger among savers if they're given the information about all of their pension pots, they engage with it, and then they find that their employment record is wrong or that their contributions have been incorrect. And finally then, a quick canter through the general landscape of pensions provision and other challenges. Well, what about, it wouldn't be a pensions evening if I didn't have a nod in the direction of defined benefit pensions. You'll be glad for this, Con. Cases like BHS and Carillion have woken more people up to the reliance on the employer covenant, and perhaps to a better understanding about what the PPF does and doesn't cover. Those cases have also shown that doing the right thing by the company pension scheme is a key marker of good corporate governance. And that is one reason why there should be and will be changes to the oversight of corporate governance in the UK, including reform of the FRC. Substantial challenges remain in the DB world for a number of what I call quasi-public sector DB schemes. And this is an area I focused on particularly at TPR because I felt it was irresponsible just to kick the can down the road, to use a current popular term. Either because they face challenges either because of the particular situation in their industry or structural changes, or because of past assumptions that they've made about the availability of government support, or, dare I say it, because some boards, notably in privatised industries, have chosen to prioritise the payment of dividends to shareholders rather than addressing the pension scheme deficit. I think this will remain a challenge for the Pensions Regulator for a number of years, both in terms of the ongoing funding of schemes and in particular situations where corporate transactions occur or major restructurings of schemes are proposed. And I feel it's unlikely that consolidation vehicles, as presently proposed, will provide an answer for the majority of schemes which face funding challenges. TPR will need to continue its vigilance and work through solutions for specific situations, such as that which we faced in the case of Tata and British Steel. Now, CDC, collective element to all this. Is it a way forward? I think it may be a very attractive solution, particularly in highly unionised industries where there is a reluctance to move away from DB pensions. And, for example, in some of the quasi-public sector situations that I mentioned earlier. But at the moment, the challenge is very practical. How do you get the legislation through in order to let it happen, to make it happen? I think it's essential that in such situations, when new shapes of provision arise, regulation should remain wherever possible structure neutral. It needs to identify the risks, argue for the appropriate legal and regulatory frameworks, and the appropriate powers to mitigate the risks, and make clear what the contract is in this case between the regulator, the saver and other parties. If the regulator argues for or against particular structures, I think it can inappropriately impede innovation. In CDC, I see the particular challenges as clear upfront communication about how the scheme works, and of course the ability to cut benefits for all if the financial position of the scheme requires it. And that's the challenge, isn't it? Will all concerned be really prepared to wear cuts to the benefits of the pensions already in payment if that's what requires and is required and the pressure comes on? Politically very difficult. A couple of other things to touch on. The first is the conundrum of advice. It is crystal clear that there is a significant gap in the availability of quality, affordable advice in relation to pensions. Not just pensions, I may add, but particularly pensions. Obviously highlighted at the moment around the challenges around DB transfers, but which is likely to continue to be a challenge given the availability of freedom and choice. I fear I don't have answers to this, other than to point out that from a quality perspective, effective regulation, in this case by the FCA, is essential, but it won't be enough in itself. FCA and TPR have to continue to work together to identify situations where pension savers may be at risk of poor advice. And this is the issue, poor advice, not out-and-out scams. Peer group pressure, continued professionalisation of advice may help. Perhaps we can hope for some new entrants to the market with a sustainable business model that doesn't drive poor behaviours through incentives. My final point is on trusteeship. The UK workplace pension model is still dependent on the role of the trustee, and in my view will remain so for a while yet. So we need to make sure that it's working as well as possible, recognising that we are asking more and more of those who in most cases are still volunteers. So I welcome TPR's paper consulting on trusteeship and governance published last week. I think it asks a number of important questions, and it is also intensely realistic about the standards of governance out there, about what TPR has been able to achieve to date, and about where standards are not good. New measures are needed. We saw that with master trusts, for example, and the need to introduce authorisation with its entry hurdle of standards of fitness, propriety and competence to look after other people's savings. Now the challenge is how to improve the standards and the outcomes in thousands of other schemes. For example, by prescribing standards for knowledge and understanding and ongoing learning. As I noted earlier, the whole system in this country depends on the saver placing their trust in a whole range of people. Their employer, their scheme trustees, the scheme's advisors and investment managers, various regulators, and of course, dare I say it, politicians. It's always been my view that everyone in the chain has to commit to doing their job as well as possible and to having the interests of savers at heart. It's very easy to try and outsource problems and challenges to somebody else, blame somebody else. At times it can be soul-destroying as a regulator to see something you've argued for lost through a political squabble between departments, or abandoned because it's just too difficult to get it through Parliament when government only has a tiny majority. But I've always believed that all involved in pensions have to play the ball in front of them, not the one they might prefer to be playing, and get on with improving the outcomes for savers step by step. We can't make things perfect overnight, but we can be pragmatic and thoughtful. We can recognise the huge trust placed in us and constantly strive to make things better. Thank you.